What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a talk show expecting a normal conversation, only to be met with disrespect, condescension, and personal attacks from a host who thinks he's untouchable? In just 38 seconds of one particularly vicious comment, everything fell apart, and America watched as Mark Wahlberg did what millions of viewers had been dreaming about for years. He stood up, called it out, and walked away, leaving one of television's most arrogant hosts completely speechless. The interview started like any other. Mark Wahlberg sat down across from Piers Morgan, ready to talk about his latest film, his fitness routine, and his life in Hollywood. The cameras were rolling, the audience was watching, and everything seemed normal. But what nobody in that studio knew was that this conversation was about to become one of the most talked about moments in talk show history. Piers Morgan leaned back in his chair with that signature smirk he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand. He looked at Mark with an expression that seemed less like curiosity and more like a challenge. The first few questions were standard fare. How was the movie? What was it like working with the director? Mark answered them all with his usual charm and authenticity, keeping things light and entertaining for the audience. But then something shifted. You could see it in Piers's eyes, the way he straightened up in his seat, the way his tone changed from conversational to confrontational. It was like he'd been waiting for this moment, planning it, building up to it. "So, Mark," Piers said, his voice dripping with false sweetness, "let's talk about your past. You've had quite the journey from the streets of Boston to Hollywood, haven't you?" Mark nodded, still calm, still composed. "Yeah, I've been very fortunate. I've worked hard to get where I am." "Worked hard," Piers repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've spent most of your career trying to make people forget who you really were." The audience went quiet. You could feel the tension rising in the room like steam in a pressure cooker. Mark's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a warning sign that Piers either didn't see or chose to ignore. "I've never hidden from my past," Mark said evenly. "I've always been honest about where I came from and the mistakes I made when I was young." "Mistakes," Piers scoffed, leaning forward now, sensing blood in the water. "You call them mistakes. Other people might call them something else entirely. You reinvented yourself, created this image of a tough guy with a heart of gold. But we all know it's just an act, don't we?" Mark took a deep breath. His jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained controlled. "I don't know what you're trying to get at, Piers, but if you've got something to say, just say it." "What I'm trying to get at," Piers said, practically grinning now, "is that you've built an entire career on playing characters who are authentic and real, when you yourself are perhaps the biggest character of all. The reformed bad boy, the family man, the dedicated actor. Which one is the real Mark Wahlberg? Or are they all just roles you're playing?" The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't banter anymore. This wasn't a tough interview. This was personal, and everyone watching knew it. "I'm the same person I've always been," Mark replied, his voice a little harder now. "I've grown, I've learned, I've tried to become a better person. That's what people do. They change, they evolve. Maybe you should try it sometime." Oh, that landed. You could see it in the way Piers's smile faltered for just a second before he recovered. But instead of backing down, instead of recognizing that he'd pushed too far, he doubled down. "That's very noble of you," Piers said with mock admiration. "Really, it's inspiring. From street thug to movie star. It's almost too perfect, isn't it? Like a movie script. Which makes me wonder how much of it is real and how much of it is just good publicity." "You don't know anything about me," Mark said quietly. The calmness in his voice was somehow more threatening than if he'd shouted. "You sit here in your expensive suit. in your comfortable chair, judging people you've never met, talking about lives you've never lived? You think that makes you important? You think that makes you better than everyone else? I think it makes me someone who asks the questions other people are afraid to ask, Piers shot back. I think it makes me a journalist who doesn't just accept the pretty picture celebrities want to paint. I dig deeper. I find the truth. The truth, Mark repeated, shaking his head. You wouldn't know the truth if it walked up and introduced itself. You're not interested in the truth. You're interested in ratings. You're interested in creating drama where there isn't any. You're interested in tearing people down so you can feel bigger. The audience was completely silent now. Some of them were nodding along with Mark's words. Others were watching with wide eyes, waiting to see what would happen next. This had gone way beyond a typical celebrity interview. This was real. Piers laughed, but it sounded forced, brittle. Oh, here we go. The victim routine. I ask a few tough questions, and suddenly I'm the villain. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Mark. You can't handle any real scrutiny. You want everyone to love you, to think you're this great guy, but the moment someone challenges that image, you fall apart. I'm not falling apart, Mark said, his voice still controlled, but with an edge that could cut glass. I'm just finally seeing you for what you really are. You're not a journalist. You're not even a good interviewer. You're a bully who hides behind a microphone and thinks that gives you the right to attack people. Attack? Piers's voice rose now, his own composure starting to crack. I'm attacking you? I'm asking you questions, Mark. That's my job. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. Maybe you should just stay in your Hollywood bubble where everyone tells you how wonderful you are. Or maybe, Mark said, standing up now, I should stop wasting my time talking to someone who clearly has no respect for me or for this conversation. Piers's eyes widened. He clearly hadn't expected this. Sit down, Mark. Don't be ridiculous. We're in the middle of an interview. No, Mark said simply. We're not. An interview is a conversation between two people who have mutual respect. This isn't that. This is you trying to embarrass me on national television because you think it'll make good TV. Well, congratulations, Piers. You got your moment, but I'm done. You can't just walk out, Piers sputtered, his face reddening. You have a contract. You agreed to be here. Watch me, Mark said, already removing his microphone. Piers stood up too now, his composure completely gone. This is incredibly unprofessional, Mark. You're making a fool of yourself. Mark paused and looked at Piers with an expression that was part pity, part contempt. No, Piers, I'm not the one making a fool of myself here. You've been doing that all on your own. After everything I've done for you, Piers said, his voice getting louder and more desperate. I gave you this platform. I invited you on my show. And this is how you repay me? By walking out like a spoiled child? You didn't do anything for me, Mark said, his voice cutting through Piers's rant. I came here to talk about my work, to connect with viewers, to have a real conversation. But you turned it into a circus. You made it about your ego, your need to prove you're some kind of hard-hitting journalist by attacking someone who came here in good faith. The audience was completely riveted now. Some of them had their phones out, recording every second. They knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. I'm not attacking you, Piers insisted, but his voice lacked conviction now. I'm doing my job. I'm asking the questions that people want answered. No, Mark said firmly. You're asking the questions that you want to ask because it makes you feel powerful. There's a difference between being a good interviewer and being cruel. You crossed that line about 10 minutes ago. Piers opened his mouth to respond, but Mark kept talking. You know what the sad thing is, Piers? You're actually talented. You could be a great interviewer if you wanted to be, but instead, you choose to tear people down. You choose to make them feel small so you can feel big. And that's not journalism. That's just mean. How dare you, Piers said, his face now fully flushed. How dare you come on my show and lecture me about journalism? You're an actor, Mark. You pretend to be other people for a living. What do you know about real work? What do you know about asking hard questions and getting to the truth? And there it was. The moment that would define this entire exchange. The moment when Piers Morgan revealed exactly who he was and what he thought about the people he invited onto his show. Mark stared at him for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but filled with absolute certainty. I know that real work means treating people with dignity. I know that asking hard questions doesn't mean you have to be cruel. And I know that getting to the truth requires actually listening to the answers instead of just waiting for your next chance to attack. You're being oversensitive, Piers said, trying to regain control of the situation. Everything I asked you was fair game. You're a public figure. You put yourself out there. That means you open yourself up to scrutiny. Scrutiny, yes, Mark agreed. Disrespect? No. There's a way to ask tough questions without being disrespectful, but you don't want to do that because disrespect gets better ratings, right? Conflict is good for business. Well, I'm not going to be part of your business anymore. This is absurd, Piers said, gesturing wildly now. The audience came here to see an interview. They want to hear from you. Are you really going to disappoint all these people because your feelings got hurt? Mark looked out at the audience. Many of them were nodding at him, encouraging him. They understood what was happening. They'd seen Piers do this before, to other guests, and they were glad someone was finally standing up to him. I'm not disappointing them, Mark said calmly. You already did that when you decided to turn this into an attack instead of a conversation. They didn't come here to watch you bully someone. They came here for an honest interview. But you're not capable of that, are you? Piers was practically shaking now, his carefully constructed persona crumbling before everyone's eyes. You're going to regret this, Mark. Walking out on my show, making me look bad. This is going to follow you. Mark actually smiled at that. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who just realized they were dealing with a person who was completely out of touch with reality. Making you look bad? Mark repeated. Piers, you're doing that all by yourself. I'm just removing myself from the situation. And as for regret, the only thing I regret is not walking out sooner. Fine, Piers snapped. Go ahead. Leave. Run away. That's what you do, isn't it? When things get tough, when someone calls you out, you just run away. No, Mark said, still calm, still in control. When someone treats me with disrespect, I remove myself from that situation. That's not running away. That's called having self-respect. You should try it. Sometime. My audience deserves better than this, Piers said, trying one last time to gain the moral high ground. You're right, Mark agreed. They do. They deserve a host who treats his guests with respect. They deserve a show that's about real conversations, not cheap shots and manufactured drama. They deserve better than you. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just gone off. The audience gasped. The crew stood frozen, unsure whether to keep filming or cut away. And Piers Morgan, for perhaps the first time in his career, was completely speechless. Mark picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and draped it over his arm. He looked one more time at Piers, then at the audience, then at the cameras. Thank you all for being here tonight, he said to the audience. I'm sorry you had to witness this. You deserve better entertainment than watching someone get torn down for no reason. I hope you all have a great evening. And with that, he turned and walked off the stage. Not rushed, not angry, just calm and dignified. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the silent studio. Piers stood there, still at his desk, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, He looked at the cameras, at his producers in the wings, at the audience staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction. "Well," he finally managed to say, his voice cracking slightly, that was unexpected. Mark Wahlberg, ladies and gentlemen, showing his true colors, unable to handle a real conversation, unable to face tough questions. But nobody was buying it. The audience remained silent. No applause, no agreement, nothing. They'd all seen what really happened. They'd watched Piers push and prod and attack until his guest had no choice but to leave. And they knew exactly who was at fault. One of the producers ran onto the stage, whispering urgently into Piers's ear. The cameras were still rolling, catching every moment of the host's humiliation. "We're going to take a commercial break," Piers announced, trying to sound professional, but failing miserably. "When we come back, we'll discuss what just happened with our panel." But everyone watching knew there was nothing to discuss. It was clear as day. A talented actor had come onto a talk show expecting a fair interview, and had instead been subjected to personal attacks and disrespect. And unlike so many other guests who'd sat there and taken it, who'd smiled through the discomfort and played along with the host's games, Mark Wahlberg had done something different. He'd stood up for himself. He'd refused to be part of the circus. Behind the scenes, as Mark walked through the backstage area, crew members were stopping him, shaking his hand, telling him he'd done the right thing. One camera operator actually applauded. A makeup artist gave him a thumbs up. They'd all worked on this show long enough to see how Piers treated people, and they were glad. Someone had finally called him out on it. Mark's publicist rushed up to him, phone in hand, looking worried. "Mark, we need to talk about damage control. We need to figure out how to spin this." But Mark just shook his head. "There's nothing to spin. What happened in there was exactly what it looked like. He was disrespectful. I called him on it, and I left. That's the whole story." "But the media is going to go crazy with this," his publicist insisted. "Let them," Mark said. "I'm not going to apologize for standing up for myself. And I'm not going to pretend that what happened in there was okay. It wasn't. And if people want to criticize me for walking out, that's their choice. But I know I did the right thing." Back in the studio, Piers was trying to regain his composure during the commercial break. His producers were huddled around him, some arguing that they should address what happened honestly, others suggesting they downplay it and move on quickly. "He made me look like a fool," Piers hissed at them. "We need to control this narrative. We need to make it clear that he was being unreasonable." But even as he said it, he could see the doubt in their eyes. They'd all watched the interview. They all knew who'd really been unreasonable. When the cameras came back on, Piers had his composure mostly back in place. He looked directly into the camera with what he probably thought was a serious professional expression. "Welcome back," he said. "As you just saw, Mark Wahlberg chose to walk out of our interview. Now, I want to be clear about something. This show has always been about asking tough questions. It's about not accepting the polished, perfect image that celebrities want to present. It's about digging deeper and finding the real story." He paused, waiting for validation that never came. The audience remained quiet. "Mark clearly wasn't comfortable with that approach," Piers continued. "And that's fine. That's his choice. But I stand by every question I asked. I believe the audience has a right to know the real person behind the image." Still nothing from the audience. If anything, they looked more uncomfortable now than they had during the actual confrontation. Piers shifted in his seat, clearly realizing that his usual tactics weren't working. "Look," he said, trying a different approach. "I have nothing but respect for Mark as an actor. But when someone comes on this show, they know what they're signing up for. They know I'm going to push them. They know I'm not going to just lob softball questions and let them promote their latest project. That's not what we do here." One brave audience member actually spoke up. "But There's a difference between asking tough questions and being mean, she said. Piers looked taken aback. I wasn't being mean. I was being honest. It felt mean, another audience member chimed in. It felt like you were trying to embarrass him. That's not what I was doing at all, Piers protested, but his voice was getting defensive again. I was simply trying to get past the carefully constructed image and find the real person underneath. By attacking him, someone else called out. This was unprecedented. The audience was supposed to be on the host's side. They were supposed to support him, laugh at his jokes, agree with his observations, but instead, they were challenging him, calling him out just like Mark had. Piers tried to laugh it off. I think perhaps we're all a bit emotional right now. Let's take a step back and look at this rationally. Mark Wahlberg is a public figure who has made millions of dollars off his image. Is it really so wrong to question that image? Is it really so wrong to ask him to defend who he says he is? But you weren't asking him to defend himself, one more audience member said. You were telling him he was fake. There's a difference. The interview was falling apart even more completely than when Mark had walked out. Piers was losing control, not just of his guest, but of his entire audience. The carefully orchestrated show, where he was the star, the one in charge, the one with all the power, was crumbling around him. I think we need to move on, Piers said abruptly, cutting off the audience discussion. We have other guests waiting, and I'm sure they'll be more willing to engage in a real conversation. But the damage was done. Everyone watching, whether in the studio or at home, had seen exactly what kind of host Piers Morgan really was. They'd seen how he treated people when they didn't play along with his games. And more importantly, they'd seen what happened when someone finally had the courage to stand up to him. In the hallway outside the studio, Mark was being interviewed by other media outlets who had heard about the walkout and rushed over. But he wasn't angry. He wasn't ranting or trying to trash Piers. He was simply calm and honest. Look, he told one reporter, I went into that interview with an open mind. I was ready to answer any questions he had. But there's a way to conduct an interview with respect and dignity, and that's not what happened in there. I'm not going to sit there and let someone disrespect me just because they have a TV show. Nobody should have to do that. Do you regret walking out? The reporter asked. Not even a little bit, Mark said with a smile. The only thing I regret is not doing it sooner. Life's too short to let people treat you badly. I don't care who they are or what platform they have. Respect is earned, not demanded. Another reporter pushed forward. What do you think this says about Piers Morgan as an interviewer? Mark thought about it for a moment. I think he's talented, but he uses that talent in the wrong way. He could create really meaningful conversations with interesting people, but instead, he chooses conflict. He chooses drama, and eventually, that catches up with you. People get tired of it. I'm just glad I didn't waste any more of my time being part of it. Back in the studio, Piers was trying to interview his next guest, but the energy in the room had completely changed. The audience was subdued. The crew seemed distracted. And hanging over everything was the question that nobody was saying out loud, but everyone was thinking. What just happened here? The rest of the show limped along, with Piers trying desperately to reclaim his authority, and his audience clearly not buying it anymore. Every joke fell flat. Every attempt at his signature sharp wit came across as mean-spirited instead of clever. The magic, such as it was, had been broken. When the show finally ended and the cameras stopped rolling, Piers sat alone at his desk for a moment. The audience had filed out quietly. The crew was packing up equipment with unusual silence. And somewhere in all of that, there was the realization that something fundamental had shifted. For years, Piers Morgan had built his career on being the tough interviewer, the one who wasn't afraid to ask the hard questions, the one who would push his guests to their limits. But what he'd always framed as strength and journalistic integrity, others saw as cruelty and ego. And tonight, in 38 seconds of one particularly vicious comment about Mark being nothing but an actor who pretends for a living, that truth had been exposed for everyone to see. Mark Wahlberg didn't destroy Piers Morgan's reputation that night. Piers had done that all by himself. Interview after interview, attack after attack, until finally, someone had the courage to say enough, to stand up and walk away, to show that the Emperor truly had no clothes. And as Mark drove home that night, past the studio where he'd just made television history, he felt lighter than he had in hours. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to stay and fight. Sometimes it's to recognize when a situation isn't worth your time or energy. Sometimes it's to simply stand up, speak your truth, and walk away with your dignity intact. The interview lasted less than 20 minutes from start to finish. But in that short time, it revealed everything anyone needed to know about both men. One was a bully who hid behind the veneer of journalism. The other was someone who refused to be bullied, no matter how big the stage or how bright the lights. And for millions of viewers who had watched over the years as Piers Morgan had belittled, insulted, and attacked his guests, all while pretending it was in service of finding the truth, this moment felt like vindication. Finally, someone had called him out. Finally, someone had refused to play the game. Finally, someone had shown that you don't have to accept disrespect just because someone has a microphone and a camera. The conversation between Mark and Piers was never just about the questions being asked or the answers being given. It was about power and respect and the line between challenging someone and attacking them. It was about the difference between an interviewer who wants to understand their guest and a host who just wants to create drama. And in the end, it was about one person deciding that their self-respect was more important than any TV appearance. Mark Wahlberg walked off that stage and never looked back. He didn't need to. He'd already said everything that needed to be said. And in doing so, he'd given a voice to every person who'd ever been bullied, every guest who'd been disrespected, every viewer who'd been uncomfortable watching someone get torn down for entertainment. It was a moment that would be replayed and discussed and analyzed for years to come. But at its core, it was simple. It was about standing up for yourself when someone tries to make you small. It was about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. And it was about the power of walking away from situations that don't serve you, no matter how much pressure there is to stay. Piers Morgan wanted to create a memorable television moment that night, and he succeeded, just not in the way he'd planned. Instead of breaking down Mark Wahlberg, instead of exposing some hidden truth or manufactured scandal, he revealed his own true nature to everyone watching. And Mark, simply by refusing to participate in his own humiliation, became the hero of a story that Piers had tried so hard to control. The lights in the studio eventually went dark. The crew went home. The audience dispersed into the night, already texting and calling friends about what they'd just witnessed. And somewhere in Hollywood, Mark Wahlberg was probably already moving on to his next project, this incident already fading into the background of a long and successful career. But for Piers Morgan, sitting alone in his dressing room, staring at his reflection in the mirror surrounded by lights, this was a moment he wouldn't forget. Because for the first time, maybe ever, someone had looked him in the eye and told him exactly what he was. Not with anger or violence or even raised voices, just with calm, honest truth. And then they'd walked away, leaving him exactly where he'd always been, alone with his ego and his ratings and his desperate need to feel important by making others feel small. And that, more than anything else that happened that night, was what would haunt him. Not the walkout itself, but what it represented. The realization that all his power, all his platform, all his carefully crafted persona as the fearless interviewer meant nothing if he couldn't treat people with basic human decency. that you can have the biggest show, the brightest lights, the most famous guests. But if you use all of that to hurt people instead of understanding them, eventually someone will call you on it. Eventually, someone will say enough. Eventually, someone will walk away. And when they do, you'll be left with nothing but the hollow echo of your own voice, talking to an audience that's finally starting to see through the act.